You have to trust me on this. This is gonna work. They won't suspect a single thing. We are finally in the clear.
I know I ain't going to be around forever. You dig what I'm saying? Those words were caught on a federal wiretap in December of 2018, spoken by a 52-year-old man who believed he was talking to a soldier he could trust with his life. He wasn't. The man on the other end of that line had already flipped, wearing a wire for federal agents, recording every syllable for a case file that had been building for years. The man on tape had no idea he had just handed prosecutors the first nail in his own coffin. His name was Raymond Betts. On the streets of Chicago's West Side, they called him Shakey Shawn. Inside the Four Corner Hustlers, he held a title no other living member of the gang could claim at the same time: Prince. This is the story of how a 25-year-old from the Austin neighborhood built one of the most feared enforcement crews in Chicago gang history, survived a 12-year sentence in one of the harshest Supermax prisons in the country, walked out and rebuilt an empire bigger than the one he lost, expanded it across state lines, and then spent the better part of a decade evading the one thing that finally caught him: his own voice, recorded and played back to him in a federal courtroom. To understand how Raymond Betts became Shakey Shawn, you have to go back to 1992. Chicago's West Side was already carved into territory by that point, and the Four Corner Hustlers had held down the Austin neighborhood for close to 2 decades. Betts was 25 years old when he formed a new faction inside the gang called the Body Snatchers, operating out of the intersection of Division and Laramie. This wasn't a crew built to move dime bags on a corner. The Body Snatchers were built for one purpose: muscle, internal discipline, territorial protection, and retaliation against anyone who threatened the supply chain running through Austin. Betts didn't build that reputation as an outsider trying to prove himself. He was already close with some of the gang's original heavy hitters, men like Walter Wheat, one of the founding figures whose name stretched back to the Four Corner Hustlers' earliest years on the West Side. Men who had been running operations since the 1970s and whose word carried weight in a hierarchy most people on the outside never got to see. To understand how deep those roots went, you have to understand that the Four Corner Hustlers weren't some loosely organized street crew improvising as they went. This was an organization with an internal chain of command, ranks, and expectations. One that had already survived police crackdowns, rival wars, and internal splits going back 2 decades before Betts ever formed the Body Snatchers. Being trusted by the men who built that structure meant something. It meant Betts wasn't climbing from the bottom. He was being handed a shortcut most soldiers in the gang would never see in a lifetime. That closeness to the old guard is reportedly what earned Betts a title that, according to gang intelligence records, no other member of the Four Corner Hustlers held at the same time: Prince, not a nickname handed out casually, a rank inside a structured criminal organization, meaning Betts answered to almost no one, and almost everyone answered to him. In a gang built around hierarchy, that kind of singular status made him both untouchable on the inside and a target for anyone on the outside looking to make a name by taking him down. But a title like that isn't free, and the bill came due fast. Police at the time linked the Body Snatchers faction to a wave of violence spreading across the West Side: shootings, killings, and reportedly even arsons that left bystanders who had nothing to do with the gang dead or injured. This was the currency Betts was trading in, not charisma, not business sense. Fear, and in the world of Chicago gang hierarchy, fear was the fastest ladder there was. It didn't take long for that ladder to collapse under him. In 1994, Betts was convicted on charges of armed violence and aggravated kidnapping. The sentence was 12 years, but where the state sent him to serve it mattered just as much as how long. Betts was shipped to Tamms Correctional Center, a Supermax facility built in the farthest reaches of southern Illinois, specifically to house the state's most dangerous offenders in near-total isolation. Tamms wasn't a place where you did easy time. It was engineered to break a man down, 23 hours a day locked in a cell, no contact visits, no group activity, nothing but concrete and silence stretching out for years at a time. Men who came out of Tamms often described losing track of basic things: the sound of another person's voice, the feeling of open air, the ability to sit in a room without instinctively counting the exits. Betts would spend 8 of his 12 years inside those walls before he saw parole. Think about what that actually means for a man who built his entire identity around control of territory. For 8 years, Raymond Betts had no territory, no crew to command, no corners to protect, no voice in what was happening to the organization he'd helped build at Division and Laramie. Every day inside Tamms was a day the West Side kept moving without him. New leaders rising, new rivalries forming. An entire generation of four-corner hustlers coming up who had never met the man behind the Body Snatchers' name. Most men in that position lose their grip on the streets permanently. The connections fade, the respect transfers to whoever filled the vacuum, and by the time release finally comes, there's nothing left to walk back into. Here's where most stories like this one end. A man goes into a place like Tamms in his 20s, and by the time he comes out, he's either finished with that life for good or too broken by the isolation to rebuild it. Betts was neither. He was scheduled for parole in October of 2004, and the timing of that release lined up with an opportunity that felt almost engineered, whether by luck or by design. Just 5 months earlier, in May of 2004, longtime West Side gang leader Ray Longstreet had been taken down on federal charges. Longstreet had run his operation like a corporation, shifts of workers moving product around the clock, using the nearby expressway to push drugs on and off the interstate with almost industrial efficiency, a model that had made his territory one of the most profitable in the four-corner hustler's entire structure. With Longstreet suddenly gone, an entire territory and drug pipeline was sitting open with no one at the top, and when Betts walked out of prison that October, he wasn't just another parolee trying to find his footing after 8 years locked away. He was one of two obvious contenders positioned to inherit what Longstreet left behind. The other man standing in his way was a high-ranking rival named William Burpee Thomas. Two men, both with standing inside the organization, both with connections and reputation to make a legitimate claim on the same territory at the exact same moment. That's the kind of situation that, in a lot of gang histories, ends in bodies. It's the setup. Exactly the sort of turf war that had defined the four-corner hustlers' rivalries for decades. But whatever played out between Betts and Thomas in those months after his release, one thing is clear. From what followed, Betts came out the other side in control, absorbing the territory and the profits that came with it, while continuing to operate alongside the same organization rather than splintering it further. What followed wasn't a war fought in the streets with headlines and body counts. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more ruthless. Betts didn't need to reintroduce himself to anyone. The reputation he'd built through the Body Snatchers' years had never faded while he sat in Tamms. The name still carried weight because the violence attached to it had never been forgotten. And unlike a man walking out of prison with no connections left, Betts still had his relationships with the gang's old guard leadership fully intact, the same heavy hitters who had elevated him to prince status in the first place. That network didn't just welcome him back, it positioned him. According to gang intelligence estimates from that period, his rebuilt operation was reportedly pulling in as much as $10,000 a day in drug sales alone. That's not survival money. That's the kind of number that rewires how a man moves through the world. Different cars, different property, a different sense of untouchability. Some accounts from that era also describe Betts maintaining a legitimate front in the beauty industry, though the details of that side business remain largely unverified beyond street-level reporting. What is documented is this. For a few years, it looked like Betts had done what almost no one manages to do. Walk out of a 12-year sentence and build something even bigger than what he'd lost. But the federal government has a long memory for men who reach that level. In May of 2008, law enforcement moved on Betts again, arresting him at his apartment in St. Charles on felony marijuana charges. This wasn't an isolated bust that came out of nowhere. It was one piece of a far larger operation called Capitol Hill, an 18-month federal investigation that ultimately swept up 55 individuals, built on more than 22,000 intercepted phone calls and over 100 separate undercover drug purchases. Think about the sheer scale of that number for a moment. 22,000 intercepted calls doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen quickly. That's the product of a task force sitting on a wiretap for the better part of 2 years, cataloging conversations, cross-referencing names, building a map of an entire network before making a single arrest. Buried inside those transcripts was a detail that showed just how far Betts had already expanded his ambitions beyond Chicago. He wasn't only running Austin anymore. He had pushed operations into Gary, Indiana, a short drive down the expressway from his home base in Riverdale, a city already struggling under its own reputation for violence and economic decline, which made it fertile ground for exactly the kind of operation Betts was looking to plant. On one recorded call, allegedly bragging to an associate about the territory, Betts described the city in blunt, almost gleeful terms, comparing it to a war zone he could move through freely. It's a chilling detail in hindsight because it shows a man who wasn't just protecting what he already had. He was actively hunting for the next city, the next expressway corridor, the next market he could take before anyone else got there first. That marijuana charge from 2008 stung, but it didn't end him. Compared to the 12-year sentence, he'd already survived a felony marijuana charge inside a 55-person sweep was almost a footnote, the kind of case that gets absorbed and forgotten by everyone except the agents building the next file. He absorbed it and kept moving, and for the next 10 years, Raymond Betts operated largely in the gray areas. Federal law enforcement couldn't yet touch a name agencies continued tracking, a pattern they kept documenting, but not yet a case strong enough to take him off the board for good. Meanwhile, the rest of the Four Corner Hustlers leadership structure wasn't sitting still either. Other high-ranking figures within the organization were running their own operations, protecting their own territory through the same mix of violence and discipline that had defined the gang since 1970s, and federal investigators were quietly building files on several of them at once, not just Betts. That patience on both sides of the investigation was about to run out completely. By the late 2010s, two federal task forces had quietly built a joint operation aimed directly at the Four Corner Hustlers' wholesale heroin pipeline. The Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force and the High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Task Force, pulling together agents and officers from federal, state, and local agencies across multiple jurisdictions, had spent years building toward exactly this kind of case, and at the center of it was a single asset more valuable than any wiretap or surveillance van: a confidential source. This wasn't a low-level runner looking to shave time off a minor charge. According to court records, the informant held the rank of 5-star elite inside the Four Corner Hustlers, one of the most trusted positions in the gang's internal hierarchy, a rank that put him in direct, regular contact with Betts himself. This was someone Betts had built years of trust with, someone he spoke to the way a man speaks to family, and by late 2018, that same person had already made the decision to cooperate with federal authorities. From that point on, every phone call Betts made to him, every meeting they arranged, every deal Betts thought he was conducting inside a closed circle was being captured on audio and video by agents watching his every move in real time. Between December of 2018 and March of 2019, Federal agents recorded 8 separate occasions where Betts, or a co-conspirator acting directly on his instructions, handed off heroin to that confidential source. Court documents put the total weight of those transactions at 136, 4 grams, not a single large shipment, but a steady, repeated pattern of wholesale distribution spread across 4 months. Exactly the kind of sustained conduct federal prosecutors need to build a conspiracy charge that holds up under scrutiny. 7 of the 8 deals took place in the Austin neighborhood, the exact territory where Betts had built his name as a 25-year-old 3 decades earlier, the same streets where the Body Snatchers first drew blood. The 8th deal allegedly happened in South suburban Riverdale, closer to where Betts was living by then. And on those recordings, Betts wasn't only moving product. He was talking expansion, laying out plans to push his operation even further into northern Indiana, the same corridor he'd bragged about a decade earlier during the Capitol Hill investigation. He had no idea how close the walls had already closed in. Every word on those tapes, every gram accounted for, every plan for growth he laid out to a man he thought was loyal, was being compiled into a case file that federal prosecutors were quietly preparing to unseal the moment they were ready to move. Picture the mechanics of it for a second. Somewhere across the city, agents were sitting in a monitoring room every time that phone connected, watching audio levels spike as Betts talked freely about product weights, delivery windows, and expansion territory, a man at the top of a criminal hierarchy having the most incriminating conversations of his life with someone he had personally vetted, personally trusted, and personally elevated within his own organization. That's the part of this story that repeats across almost every major federal takedown of a West Side gang leader. It is rarely a rival that brings a man like Betts down. It's almost always someone standing close enough to hear everything. On May 29th of 2019, that moment arrived. A criminal complaint dropped, and Raymond Betts was arrested and charged with conspiracy to possess a controlled substance with intent to distribute. He wasn't taken down alone. 2 co-conspirators were named in the same complaint: Angela Bell, then 48 years old, of Chicago, and Morris Williams, known on the street as Big Fella, Big Ride, and Naz, 50 years old, of Riverdale. Federal prosecutors were careful to state publicly, as they are required to under the law, that a criminal complaint is not evidence of guilt, and that all 3 defendants were presumed innocent until proven otherwise in court. But the evidence stacked against Betts wasn't circumstantial, and it wasn't built on second-hand testimony that a defense attorney could pick apart. It was his own voice, recorded across months of surveillance, laying out the exact conspiracy prosecutors would use to build their case against him. For nearly 4 years, the case moved through the machinery of the federal court system in the Northern District of Illinois. Motions filed, evidence reviewed, plea negotiations opened and closed behind closed doors, and in January of 2023, Raymond Betts made the same decision so many high-ranking gang figures before him have made. Once the evidence becomes impossible to argue with, he pleaded guilty, 1 count, conspiracy to distribute heroin. His co-defendants followed the same path in the months after. Morris Williams pleaded guilty to the same charge, with his sentencing scheduled for July of that year. Angela Bell also entered a guilty plea, her sentencing set for that May. The organization that had operated with near impunity across 2 decades, through multiple prison sentences and multiple federal investigations, was being dismantled in a Chicago courtroom, 1 guilty plea at a time. There was no trial for Betts, no jury to convince, no defense strategy built around reasonable doubt. When the government has your own recorded voice describing quantities, prices, and delivery locations across 8 separate transactions, a guilty plea isn't really a decision anymore. It's damage control, the only remaining lever a defendant has left to pull in hopes of shaving years off a sentence. Federal guidelines would otherwise stack much higher. In April of 2023, the final chapter was written. Raymond Betts, now 56 years old, stood in front of a federal judge and was sentenced to 120 months in prison, 10 years, followed by 8 years of supervised release once he walks out. The sentencing was announced jointly by the acting United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, alongside the special agent in charge of the ATF's Chicago Field Division, the special agent in charge of the DEA's Chicago Field Division, the Cook County Sheriff, and the acting superintendent of the Chicago Police Department. When 5 separate law enforcement leaders show up together to announce one man's sentencing, it tells you something about how long he'd been on their radar and how much weight this particular case carried for agencies that had circled him, in one form or another, for over 2 decades. 10 years is not a life sentence, and it's worth being precise about that, because the story of Raymond Betts doesn't end with him vanishing behind bars forever. A man sentenced at 56, even accounting for the 8 years of supervised release that follow his prison term, will very likely walk free again while he's still capable of living a full life outside those walls. That's a different kind of ending than the one the streets usually write for men who reach the rank of prince. Most of his predecessors and rivals in Four Corner Hustlers' leadership either died in the life or were buried under sentences guaranteeing they'd never see daylight again. Betts, by comparison, is one of the rare ones who may get a second act for better or worse, depending on which direction he takes it. What's left behind on the west side is an organization, still standing but visibly hollowed out at the top. Researchers who track Chicago gang structures note that much of the Four Corner Hustlers' old leadership, the generation that came up alongside men like Betts, Longstreet, and Burpee Thomas, has either died off, aged out of the life, or been systematically removed through a wave of federal prosecutions over the past several years. Other high-ranking figures inside the same organization have faced their own reckonings since, and the scale of those cases puts Betts's sentence into sharper perspective. One former Four Corner Hustler leader was convicted by a federal jury of racketeering conspiracy, tied directly to 4 separate murders committed between 2000 and 2003, a conviction carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of life in prison. Another member of the same organization pleaded guilty to a racketeering conspiracy charge, admitting his role in 2 of those same killings, and was sentenced to 427 months, well over 3 decades in federal prison. Set against sentences like those, Betts's 10 years reads almost like a lighter outcome, a reminder that his case was built specifically around drug distribution, not murders and racketeering charges that have buried other men from the same organization for the rest of their lives. The Four Corner Hustlers as an organization hasn't disappeared by most accounts. It's expanded into new suburbs and even other states, and federal task forces have continued targeting its open-air drug markets in operations that stretched well past Betts's own case, seizing kilograms of heroin, fentanyl, and cocaine, along with dozens of firearms in follow-up investigations. But the specific era Raymond Betts represented, the Body Snatchers years, the Prince years, West Side heroin pipeline running straight through Austin, effectively closed the day that April 2023 sentence was read into the record. There's a version of this story that plays clean, like a cautionary tale with a tidy lesson at the end. A 25-year-old builds a violent enforcement crew, survives a brutal 12-year sentence inside one of the country's most isolating prisons, walks out and rebuilds an empire reportedly generating $10,000 a day, expands it across state lines into Indiana, and still, after all of that, ends up right back in a federal courtroom because he trusted the wrong person with the wrong conversation. That's the surface pattern, not police work alone, not luck alone, betrayal from inside his own circle, recorded word for word across 4 months, used against him in the exact system he'd spent 3 decades trying to outmaneuver. But there's a harder layer underneath that doesn't fold into a clean lesson so easily. Raymond Betts didn't get caught once. He got caught repeatedly in 1994, in 2008, and finally in 2019, and each time, he found a way back into the life until the evidence became too overwhelming to survive. That's not the profile of a man who slipped once and paid for it. It's the profile of a man who kept running the same calculation over and over, that the risk was worth the reward, until a federal task force with 22,000 intercepted calls, years of patient surveillance, and a flipped five-star elite member finally proved him wrong for the last time. The west side of Chicago hasn't stopped producing men willing to run that same calculation. New names step into every vacancy left behind when a Betts, a Longstreet, or a high-ranking enforcer gets taken off the board. Organizations these men built don't die with them, they adapt, they promote from within, they find the next person willing to absorb the risk in exchange for the reward. What changes with every case like this one is the intelligence federal agencies accumulate along the way, the informants they develop, the patterns they learn to recognize faster, the wiretap techniques refined case after case. Every takedown feeds the next one. The same task forces that spent years building the file on Raymond Betts didn't stop working once his cuffs went on. They moved on to the next name on the org chart, the next open-air market, the next phone number worth watching. There's also a version of this story that never makes it into a press release, and it's the one that matters most to the people who actually lived through it. Every gram of heroin moving through Austin during those years passed through a community that had nothing to do with the gang politics or the rank of prince. Violence attributed to the Body Snatchers in the early 1990s didn't just settle old scores between rivals. Police at the time linked the faction to arsons and shootings that hurt residents who had no part in any of it. That's the cost that never shows up in a DOJ press release announcing a sentencing. It shows up in a neighborhood's history, in families who lost people to a war they never signed up for, in a stretch of the West Side that's still working to rebuild trust with the same institutions that spent 30 years trying and failing to get Raymond Betts off those streets. Raymond Betts spent 30 years building a reputation that outlived his freedom not once, but twice. Whether he walks out of federal prison in his mid-60s and stays out for good this time, or whether the pull of that world proves too strong one more time, is a story that hasn't been written yet, but the version already on the permanent record is clear enough. The Prince of the Four Corner Hustlers didn't fall to a rival gang, a street shooting, or a rushed police raid at his door. He fell to a recording device, a trusted associate who turned on him, and 30 years of decisions that finally caught up to him in a federal courtroom in the Northern District of Illinois.